content, exciting stuff, right? Maybe not the most entertaining of subjects, but it's definitely not something to be taken lightly. And it's usually going to make you end up wanting to scream at the wall and not know what to do. So we're going to talk today about the Migrate module, the Migrate project from Drupal. It's a module, but it's one of those modules that you install. It doesn't really do anything for you out of the box. It's not a UI that you can do the migration through. It requires you to write code, but it's a framework essentially that just makes writing your queries, putting everything into Drupal a lot easier, so you don't have to manually do it. So let's get started. So assumptions for the Sesh. Just, assuming that you're familiar somewhat with Drupal module development, at least to some degree, you know what needs to go into it. Familiar somewhat with Drupal objects, nodes, users, that kind of thing. At least some understanding of object-oriented PHP. Migrate is an object-oriented framework, so that's how you're going to be writing it. I'm definitely no expert on it, but I'm able to, I was able to kind of pick up the module pretty quick, just, kind of knowing how to get around classes and that kind of thing. And then also going to assume that you have some familiarity with writing SQL queries and using Drupal's query interface in Drupal 7 to generate those. So just a little bit about me. Again, my name is Brandon Kalber. I've been working with Drupal for about 5 years. In that time, I've gotten to work on some pretty cool projects. I helped build out the 2012 ASPCA Challenge, which is kind of a contest fundraising website. And then my first job, actually, when I got out of school, where I learned Drupal, was I was with DC United for 2 years, which is part of Major League Soccer. We were running a Drupal 6 site. Before that, I think I had tried to fiddle around a little bit with Drupal 5. It made absolutely no sense to me. I hated it. Then when I actually learned how to use Drupal properly in Drupal 6, completely opposite story. So currently I'm with Designzillas. We're a small agency in downtown Orlando, specializing in custom Drupal design and development. And outside of that, I'm a musician. Play bass, play in some bands around town, do some freelance gigs and that kind of thing. So I guess probably just a good time to do maybe just like a quick show of hands, since like anyone had to do big content migrations. We're like mainly talking about like going from a non-Drupal site, some kind of legacy CMS or proprietary system into Drupal. So lots of times, cool. What are some of the tools you guys use to do it? Feeds? Yeah. Commerce feeds, cool. Custom scripts, anything like that? Cool. Yeah. So, I don't know what your experiences are like in doing that, but I definitely know anytime I have to do it, you kind of realize, kind of simply, one does not simply migrate into Drupal. Yeah, it's true. Moving on. Talk a little bit about the goals. So, kind of going to, obviously we want to talk about the Migrate project, why you might want to consider using that for the next time you have to do a big migration. Before that, just kind of talk a little bit about like preparing for a migration, things you need to be aware of, things to keep in mind, even like before you decide on using Migrate. That's going to kind of segue a little bit into deciding on the tool, determining your use case. What do you need to accomplish with your migration? Obviously, we're going to talk about why you might want to use the Migrate module. And of course, the majority of the time we're going to be, hopefully, I'm going to try to give you just a basic understanding of using Migrate to build migrations. It's going to, try to keep it, for the most part, pretty high level, because, you can do anything you kind of need with Migrate. It's huge, it's completely customizable, so it really just depends on what you need to do. So we're just going to go over the basics, things you need to be aware of, things to keep in mind when you start playing around with it. Cool. So, preparing for your migration. Obviously, you want to know the source data pretty intimately. This, can mean a lot of things. Basically, if you have a web page, you have a blog article, you want to know where everything that's on that page, how it's stored in the database, how it relates to other content types. Obviously, you have a title, a body, a date, an author, but what does that really mean when you examine the data? Of course, you also want to know like the data you can't see, like how are dates stored as a small example. How does the source store dates? Is it a timestamp, a time string? Also determine your big challenges. Kind of what that means to me is like how crazy of a query are you going to have to write? Are you going to have to do a lot of crazy joins? Is the source data in just a completely different data structure than Drupal? Most likely it is. So after you kind of spend a lot of time doing that, and honestly that's probably the most time that I tend to spend outside of actually writing the code to do the migration, is just getting to know the data. On the Drupal side, you can start building out your content types, but keeping in mind the source, of course. So whereas you might just like, well, I need an article, I need some kind of page, you put some fields on it, you know how Drupal is going to do it, that's fine. But when you're coming from a migration, obviously you want to think of how you can make the source data work with Drupal while also allowing Drupal to and the new system to do what the new functionality is going to need to do. So keep that in mind when you're building out your content. It's like, what kind of field widgets do you want to use? Do you want to use references versus entity reference? I mentioned that just because I found out with Migrate, out of the box, it doesn't have support for entity reference, but it does have support for references. So, you might have to tweak content types. Again, how do you want to store dates? How do you want to store all your data? So, just whatever's going to make it the least painful process or painless process to put the data in there. So, after you've kind of done all that, you want to think about deciding on a tool. So again, based on the source data, determine your use case. Really, what I mean by that is what does your migration need to do? What kind of mappings are you going to have? Is it do you have just a lot of like kind of one-to-one relationships, or do you have a lot of circular dependencies, data that's going to reference other data? And based on that, we kind of already talked about this. It seems like a lot of you are familiar with some of the options you have for putting stuff into Drupal. Feeds, obviously, feeds is awesome, and you don't even necessarily have to be a developer to use it. Custom one-off scripts, interns copying and pasting content from the client. hopefully you're not doing that, but hey, maybe whatever works. I've seen heard some other talks that people have given on using Migrate, and they've kind of said something that I tend to agree with wholeheartedly, is that if feeds or custom scripts or something like that works for you, if it suits your use case and does what you need it to do, you probably just want to go ahead and use it, because Migrate has a really steep learning curve. You have to write a lot of code, and these other, some of the other methods might be faster and easier, but they're not as flexible, not quite as performant, and may not always work. So kind of what inspired me to kind of give this talk is I hadn't used Migrate before. Recently had to do a migration from a complete legacy system, proprietary kind of system, kind of a wiki style site. So a lot of historical data. We had to migrate in the content, but also all the content revisions, users, comments, comment revisions, and users can be, it's a wiki, so users could be node author or content authors, they could be content contributors. So we had to keep that all in mind and how we're going to make that into Drupal. So Migrate, I thought, fit that perfectly, because it kind of just, again, it lets you write, you're going to write your own queries to get all the data out that you need. So if feeds and custom scripts aren't going to work for you and your interns are sick, why would you want to use Migrate? Kind of already mentioned, but Migrate's a powerful framework and it performs really well. So if you're going to be running your migrations through Migrate, it's either going to be using Drush. That's going to be that's obviously the preferred method for running them. You can run it through the browser, and I think that uses the Drupal batch API. Either way, though, if you're importing, thousands of nodes, it holds up well. I haven't really found since I've used it, I haven't really had to worry about timeouts very much. So, obviously it's meant for big migrations. Out of the box, it supports core Drupal objects. So obviously nodes, users, files, terms, comments. And what that means is it knows how to handle that data. It knows how to save it. So you don't have to, if you've run, your own custom scripts, or if you've just ever had to do any kind of like creating nodes programmatically, kind of how Drupal stores its data is not always the most intuitive. So Migrate does a lot of that for you. It's easily extended, so I'm just going to put this out there. If you want to use Migrate, you're probably also going to want to use the Migrate Extras module. What the Extras module is, it's just it's an add-on module for Migrate that a bunch of the people in the community, other contrib module developers have. It's basically a suite of modules, I think, and I think you can actually enable them one at a time depending on what you need. But basically, for all the Drupal-y stuff, fields, other modules that Migrate doesn't support out of the box, Migrate Extras, probably there's a good chance that you'll be able to find the support you need in that module. And in fact, if you look at the Migrate Extras project page, it tells you between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7, it lists out a bunch of all the requests they've had, if it's supported, if it's not supported, if it's in development, that kind of thing. So it's pretty up to date. You'll get to know what's coming. If Migrate Extras isn't, if all else fails, you can extend it yourself. So if, one thing I found out was, I mentioned I had to do a bunch of revisions in this migration I had to do. Migrate doesn't really do that out of the box. And neither, nothing really was out there. So kind of through some Googling and seeing what other people's solution, I was able to kind of extend Migrate, make my own destination handler that basically just made Drupal aware of the version ID so that it would keep track of that and map it up to the appropriate node. As I mentioned before, I didn't. It provides, out of the box, there's a separate module that gives you a Migrate UI. It's pretty basic, but it's really nice. You can run migrations through it. That's what I mentioned. It's going to be using the batch API. I've personally, for actually running the full migration, I would use Drush. It's got really good integration with that, but the UI is nice for testing. You could, get your initial query set up, your initial classes and everything, see what the data is going to look like. You could maybe just limit the import to 10 nodes, run it through the UI, kind of see what kind of errors you get, if any. And also, within each of your classes, it lets you see, it kind of spits out the query for you, kind of like Views does. So after you kind of write it using the Drupal query interface, you can kind of like actually just copy and paste the SQL into whatever, database tool UI, can kind of just run the data that way and make sure it, is as you expect. And also, it's going to give you a list of all the sources fields that you've defined and all your destinations and the mappings, and we'll get into this later, obviously. But if anything's missing, if there's a field or something that you've defined but you haven't mapped it anywhere, the UI and Drush will tell you as well. It's going to yell at you basically that, hey, you haven't told me where to put this data. So it's pretty handy. Migrations are easily rolled back. So say you import, 1,000 blog articles, you realize you made a mistake or something, something was just wrong, or, who knows what the reason is. Migrate actually lets you roll back a migration. So, and when it's rolled back, all the records that were just imported are deleted. So you can just fix whatever you need to fix, re-import, no harm done. Yeah. And we kind of already talked about, obviously it supports core objects out of the box. So like I said, it knows how to handle Drupal data. So now that you guys totally love Migrate, let's talk a little bit about how it works in detail. So we're talking about Migrate version 2. I don't know much about version 1. I think it was primarily views-based. I've never used it, so I can't speak much about that. But currently we're on version 2.5, which is code-based. The Drupal 7 version requires, it doesn't have any dependencies, so you can just kind of enable it, read up on the documentation, and start rolling. If you want to use it for Drupal 6, it does require that you use the autoload module, dbtng, and elements. I think I haven't used it for Drupal 6 personally, but I think most of anything we talk about in this is going to be for Drupal 7, but I think that'll apply for the D6 version as well. Documentation-wise, when you install the module, it's going to also come kind of bundled with what's called Migrate Examples module. So that's really where the best documentation is. It's actually a module that you can install. It makes some kind of dummy tables in your database with some dummy data, and you can actually run the migrations either via the UI or Drush, kind of see how it works, get familiar with it. But then also the code. It's probably where you can probably copy a lot of code examples out of there, see how they're using the module, and it's all commented very well. So if you're not sure what a method's actually doing, it should be listed in there. And every time the module gets released, hopefully that examples module will get updated as well. And in there's a beer.inc and a wine.inc. That's kind of like a basic example, a little bit more advanced example. And I think there's also an example of Oracle in there as well. So just be aware of that. Google, obviously, and the issue queue, always check those, but just know you're going to have to dig a lot to find probably the answers you want for Migrate. And it's not that the documentation is lacking, it's just that it is very actively supported, and it's kind of constantly evolving. So by the time if you read something in the issue queue of how to do something, it may not necessarily be valid for the current version of the API. Migrate, like I said, it's an API, so you're going to have to write a module in order to run your migrations. It's got all the basic stuff that obviously every module would. You need a .module file. The only thing you really need your .module file to do is implement hook migrate API, and all that does is just tells what version of the API you're using. It's pretty much the same thing if you guys have ever done anything with integrating views or CTools in your module. It's the similar kind of API hook as that. And if you're feeling lazy, if you don't have a large migration class to write, you could probably plop your migration classes in the .module file if you wanted to. It's not best practice, but hey, it's up to you. But really, all you need, hook migrate API. Outside of that, in your .info file, you just need to make sure that if you are making your classes .inc files, that you register them in the files that are right in the .info file. This is going to let Migrate's autoloader find them. So after all that's set up, essentially you're going to start writing your classes, or a class that's going to extend the base migration class that Migrate provides. And within the class, this is all going to be within the constructor. You're going to set up a map, a source, a destination, field mappings, dependencies if you need any. Again, that's inside the constructor. So those four things, the map, the source, destination, and field mappings, those are kind of like the basic components that actually make up a migration. So we're going to kind of look at each of those a little bit in depth as we go on. So the first one is the map. I think the map is probably one of the biggest benefits that you're going to get out of using Migrate, say over maybe writing your own custom script. It describes the key schema. So really what the map does, it's a new table that Migrate's going to create for you. It's going to keep track of the old source IDs versus the new Drupal IDs. So if you kind of look at again, this is a code example from the beer.inc file in the Migrate Examples module. So inside your constructor, you're going to set this map equal to a new Migrate SQL map. We'll touch on this a little bit more later, but it doesn't have to be SQL. Migrate does support CSV, JSON, and XML. We're pretty much going to be focusing on SQL for this talk, though. So it's a new Migrate SQL map. The first parameter you pass in is this machine name. That's really going to be the name of the class that your Migrate is, except I think Migrate trims off the word migrate. So in this example, if it was called migration or beer node migration, machine name would really be beer node. That's what it's going to use as the table name. Second parameter is going to be an array. It's your schema for your source key, essentially. So from the source data, beer ID, you define what it's like. You can give it an alias that's optional, but if you're going to use an alias in your query. So as I noted, BID here would probably, if that's beer ID, that's probably going to map to something like node ID in Drupal. And because Migrate is storing all this data in the map, you can actually use this data later to great benefit. The third parameter you pass in, you're just basically calling key schema for whatever type of object you're passing in. So migrate destination node, it could be destination user, term, comment, whatever. So next, a little bit about the source. So the source is responsible, that's basically what's going to query your data. As I mentioned, it supports SQL, CSV, XML, and JSON. And in the Migrate examples module, there's examples of all of those. So if you want to learn more, just download the module and kind of play with it there. So to the right, I kind of put, obviously it's a pretty simple query, but just so you get an idea of the syntax, you just define whatever your query is going to be. Probably you're going to have a lot more joins and all kinds of other things. But you just set this source equal to a new migrate source SQL. Obviously, if you're using CSV, it would be migrate source CSV. The source provides you a list of source fields, and then it's responsible for iterating over all your rows. So when you actually look at, if you use the UI and you look at your migration, it's going to list out, hey, this is all the data you told me to find. So you can kind of double check. So the source, obviously next we need our destination. So a little bit less to this syntax-wise. So you've already written your query. You've told Migrate what your source is. You defined your map. Now you need to tell it kind of like what to expect on the Drupal side. So you just set this destination to whatever object it is. Again, so it's going to be a new instance of Migrate destination node. And you pass in, so in this example, Migrate beer example, that's whatever the content type is. So, you pass in blog article, photo gallery, whatever. And that, it's going to be the same for users, comments, but basically that's going to, tell Migrate, it's automatically going to know what to expect in your object, what fields your content type has. So you can actually do your mappings, which we'll get to in a second. So the destination, it's responsible for writing the source data to Drupal, and then, like I probably mentioned it a few times by now, based on the destination entity, it knows how to save it. So something like source row, in this case row name, that would be from the source, might translate on the Drupal side to the lovely, Drupal data structure, node, field, whatever language, key, value. And again, just know that if you're doing any other kind of Drupal object or a user or term, you just create a new instance of that class. So migrate destination user and then pass in the arguments. So cool. And if any time, just shout out a question, or if I'm going too fast, just let me know. So we've got our source, we've got our destination, so we know what data we're getting. We know where we're putting it, when we've got a map to kind of link it together, but we haven't said what relates to what. So that's where field mappings come in. Kind of self-explanatory what field mappings do. They're kind of what link the source and destination together. So, you would call this for every field that you need to save into Drupal. So it could be a lot, so if you have a really big content type with a ton of fields, you're going to be copying and pasting the this add field mapping code a lot. So it takes two arguments by default. The first is destination field, and then you pass in the source field. I always get that backwards, and then wonder why Migrate's yelling at me. So it's destination field first, then source field. Migrate does provide some built-in functions to kind of help you parse data, and you can chain these on to the field mappings. So a good example, like a simple example, would be the separator. So you could say this add field mapping, and then you chain on separator, and you could pass in, a comma as a string or a pipe. You might use that if you're like importing taxonomy terms and you're putting it, whatever, like an autocomplete widget. so if you pass in separated a comma, it's, Migrate's going to know how Drupal expects that data. It's going to be able to parse it and save it the way that it should. So again, it's just taking a lot of you're still having to write a lot of code, but like Migrate just has so many helpers built in that, just kind of saves you a lot of time. Pardon me. Oh, another good example, I'm just going to mention this really quick. For when you're creating taxonomy terms, there's another function that you can call, which is create term. It's true or false. So if you're importing, say, you could do taxonomy terms like all as one migration. If you didn't want to do that, another option might be to, like, as you're importing nodes, like if you have blog articles that have terms with them already, and you already have that in your query, you could just set create term to true so that you let your taxonomy terms be created kind of as a side effect of your migration. So it's pretty handy. Just note that, like, to make run some tests on it first. The last time I tried to use it, it took me like a few days to realize that somehow, like, all of my terms, it was being created like, I don't know, quadruple times. So I had, like, I don't know how many thousands of duplicate terms in the database, and I didn't discover it until, like, the taxonomy and context pages just wouldn't load. So, handy function, but just be aware of it. In addition to what Migrate provides for you out of the box, you can define your own callbacks to process data on your field mapping. So you use that by chaining on the callbacks method. So the little code example, you're still calling the field mapping, passing in your destination field, your source field, callbacks, and then you pass in an array, and myreb method, that's what you define. So you'd set that out of your constructor, and that's really whatever you need to do. You could trim white space, strip HTML tags, that's totally up to you. Also, just a good thing to be aware of, Migrate needs everything to be accounted for, or at least it likes everything to be accounted for. So, if you're doing a migration, you don't always care about all the data in the source, and you may not necessarily need to map every Drupal field just from the migration, So, if you kind of just don't tell Migrate anything about them, it's going to throw errors up all over the place and say, hey, you're missing this field. I don't know what to do with this. It's in your query, but I don't know where to put it. So if you have source data that you don't need, you can just set unmigrated sources. You can just pass an array of the fields that you want to ignore. Same thing with destinations. So it just takes an array of destination fields that basically just tells Migrate, don't worry about it, and it'll be happy. So if you kind of put all these four things together, this kind of makes up like a basic migration. It's a pretty dumb table, but pretty self-explanatory. But obviously, you have your source data, your destination data. That's whatever legacy database you have. Your Drupal object. Your field mappings are what links those two together. And again, your map, that's kind of off to the side. That's a separate table that Migrate's going to create for you. And essentially, again, what it does, it's keeping track of your source ID and the new Drupal ID. And the next slide is kind of like where that really comes in handy. So using source migration. So when you're making your field mappings, you can set a source migration. So really what this does is it uses the map that you already defined from whatever the relevant migration is that you pass in to translate source IDs into Drupal IDs. So say you've already imported all your users. You got 500 new Drupal users on your site. Everything's good. They've got their usernames preserved. They've got new Drupal UIDs. If you're importing content, obviously all the content needs an author. If in your source query you have the old user IDs, when you're importing that, you can set source migration to basically look up the old UID that you already imported in your user migration, and the map's automatically to match that up to the new UID, Drupal UID rather, and set the node author appropriately. So you don't have to do a lot of crazy lookups because that map table is storing everything for you. It just saves a ton of time. And then you can set a default value if for some reason the user ID isn't found. If you do that, it's a good idea to set dependencies. Again, as you probably might guess, you're just going to say, if you set a source migration, dependency is just going to make sure that migrate runs first. So you can't run your migration until, like your node migration, until the user migration runs. So yeah, I can't tell you how much time that saved me in doing these kind of crazy imports. So kind of just some other things to be aware of. Migrate has a lot of built-in methods that you can use. These are all going to be outside of your constructor now. So your fields are done, your source is done. These are all methods that you can use to kind of just help manipulate data kind of at various points within the migration process. So the first one's prepare row. And basically the current row that's being iterated over in the migration, it's passed in as an object. So it allows you to manipulate whatever data you want. So if you kind of look at the really simple example I put in there, I had to do this about 50 times the last time I used it. The source data, the node dates were all stored as date strings. Obviously Drupal needs them as a timestamp, so you can use prepare row to kind of just set the data to how you need it. Next up, so after prepare row, we have the prepare function, which aptly named is not the same as prepare row. Prepare, it's kind of the way to think about it, it's kind of called, so prepare row is called between your source data being queried before your migration touches it. Prepare is kind of called after all the other handlers have been called. Including the field handlers. So at this point, it's still going to accept the row, the source row as an object, but it's also going to have kind of the new entity, and this is the entity of what will be saved in Drupal. It hasn't been saved yet, but it's kind of already formulated it, and it's about to be saved. So this is the last chance you have to kind of manipulate any data before it gets populated into the Drupal record. And then lastly, you have the complete method. So complete, as you could probably guess, that's actually called after the record is saved. So the new entity that's been saved in Drupal is passed in now at this point, along again with the source row. So a really good example, simple example, but handy of having to do this. Again, I mentioned the big thing I had to do with node revisions. I didn't really know this at the time, but and it makes sense logically. The way Drupal handles node revisions, anytime that node is saved with a new version, it sets the version, the node date to the current date, because obviously it thinks it's updated at that point. Makes sense, but the problem was, I was losing all my revision history. So, I'd have 20 revisions for a node, and it'd all say the date, was last updated today, by me as the as the site admin account. The data was still there, but it didn't really preserve the history, which was a big requirement. So using the complete function, you can, it's already been saved. So at this point, node save has already run. It's set the date to what Drupal thinks it should be, but then you can just run a quick update query to set the timestamp on the revision and the node table to what it should be, because Drupal is already done. It's done, and it won't touch it again. So. Pretty handy stuff. Kind of the last big thing we're going to talk about. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just so that you know that you're aware of it, is Stubs. So we kind of already, one way that Migrate helps you deal with circular dependencies, data that relies on other data, was in a few slides back, we talked about the source migration, where you say, hey, I've already imported my users, match up the UIDs for me for the node author. Stubs allow you to, you're still going to need to define a source migration for this, but what stubs do, a good example is, so you're importing all blog articles, you have a node reference, what will be a node reference field, but they're all the same article type. Article A references article B. When you're importing, article A gets imported, but article B hasn't been imported yet, so what do? So stubs kind of let you help you handle that. Essentially, all you're going to do, if you implement the create stub method, you basically set up a dummy node, and you would do it just like you would make any other node programmatically, except you just kind of pass in dummy data. And then Migrate it's going to return the node ID of that dummy node. And then when article B finally runs again, Migrate using the map table is going to be able to look up the dummy node ID and then replace all the dummy data with the new data that's being imported. So, it just saves, again, you don't have to run separate migrations in order for this to happen. So that's kind of the majority of stuff for the big picture stuff from Migrate. I know it's a lot. Again, it really just depends on what your use case is, what you need to do with Migrate. The best thing to do is just kind of start playing around with it, look at the examples module, and I would also say if you have to do a big migration using Migrate, maybe try to pad in a couple extra days into your quote of how long you think it's going to do, because I don't know, probably spent more time than I care to admit just banging my head on my keyboard trying to get Migrate to do what I wanted. But in the end, obviously, I liked it enough that I wanted to try to put this presentation together to hopefully, say, hey, it's worth the headaches. Just really quick, what's next for Migrate? I was just kind of browsing the project page last night. Migrate 2.6 is under development. According to the project page, it's really focusing on a new UI and then also a new API that I don't know much about. I'm just kind of putting it out there again, but apparently it's tailored to kind of let module developers kind of create more like a wizard style UI for allowing more non-developers to use the Migrate framework for their migration. So maybe it's becoming another version of these. I don't know if that means the code-based migrations are totally going away. I don't know, but after that, it's going to be Migrate 3 for Drupal 8. And again, quoting the project page, apparently Migrate 2.6 is going to be a good proof of concept for how Migrate 3 is going to work in Drupal 8. Also, some things, if you're interested, there's some specialized migration modules out there that are using the framework, but to do specific things. So again, never used any of these, but in case you're interested, Drupal Migrate D to D. So one thing, admittedly, that Migrate doesn't do well is going from previous versions of Drupal, because nothing really does that well. But it looks like they're working on that. It's a supported module now, so you now can have support if you need to go from 5 to 6, 6 to 7, etc. Somebody's used it to make a module for WordPress migrations, Typo 3, PHP VB. So those are out there too, if that's what you need to do. And lastly, just some useful links. I don't know why I put the project page on there, because that's easily Googled, but just helpful to know, there's a whole page, a whole article on typical Migrate commands using Drush. So that's definitely something to be familiar with. And then if you're interested more in learning about the stubs, there's a good article called Chicken and Eggs Using Stubs that kind of just goes more in depth about how to create that. So yeah, we're right at about 7 minutes. That's all I got for you guys. So thanks. We can take questions. I have this book I'm supposed to give away. So it's not about Migrate, but it is about Drush, and I think the guy who wrote Drush is also a big contributor to Migrate, so full circle, I guess. Yeah, so.
That map table, is that a temporary table that gets deleted when you're done running Migrate, or does that stay there?
It'll stay on there. One thing one of the benefits of making your migration into a module is that you can disable it after the module runs. What I'm not sure about is if on uninstall, if the map table gets deleted. I'm actually not 100% sure on that. I haven't had to do it, but it's not temporary. It's going to stay. Yes?
Have you ever had any experience migrating user accounts out?
User accounts? Yes.
Yes. How did you handle, migrating the passwords over and getting those into Drupal?
Well, the last time I had to do it, I was lucky in that was not a requirement. So we had to migrate everything but that. Any other time I've tried to do that, I don't know of a good way to do it, because just trying to figure out the hashing methods between two different systems, I don't know. I don't think there is, yeah.
I didn't know if you had any tips or tricks.
No, I don't, unfortunately. So if anyone else does, let me know, because I'd love to know.
One-way encryption for their passwords.
Yeah.
I've heard you just reset everybody's password to something and make them change it.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the last time I had to do user accounts. We kind of just let them know up front, we'll put everything there, but just your users, it's going to be a new system. They're going to have to, all their other data is the same. Just hit the request new password button. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about how to cancel the migration.
How to cancel the migration?
Yeah, how to roll back, and if the tables will be deleted from the database.
Pardon me. The tables won't be deleted. So if you cancel, I'm not actually sure of the Drush command to cancel. You can do it through the UI, and I think Migrate it'll be kind of cool with that. So if you cancel for some reason, it'll kind of let you stop it and then pick up back where you left off, or roll back where you left off. Rolling back's a little different. Rolling back's not going to delete the tables.
It will delete data.
It'll delete the data because, well, you know.
But if I want to change the fields types, for example.
You can do that. No, absolutely, yeah. So say, and the most recent time I had to do this a lot. Like, I built out a bunch of content types.
Yeah, like
and
with data test stamps or something, and like, oh.
Exactly, yeah. So the last time I did it, we kind of did the migration before we did much building of the site functionality. So I kind of did an initial migration, and then like as we kind of got more into building out the site, I'm like, man, like I should have built these content types way different. So. So I did, I kind of rolled back the migrations that I'd already done, rebuilt the content types, renamed the fields, reusing a lot more fields between content types, and then just, it's a little tedious because you have to update all your classes where you define those fields, but as soon as you do it, Migrate's aware of it, and then it'll let you run the migration again, and it's happy. Because essentially, it's the fields are a Drupal database, so all your, and when you define your destination handler in Migrate, it's basically looking up what those fields are for you. So it could be named something, you could delete a field, add a new field. As long as you're defining that destination handler in your migration, it's going to find that for you and say, hey, tell me what data from the source you want to map into here. Anything else? Yes, sorry.
How nicely does Migrate play with variations in Drupal commerce?
That I don't know. I haven't had to use it for commerce yet, so probably not the guy to ask, unfortunately. I don't know. So someone else in here, I think, said they had used commerce.
Commerce feeds.
Oh, commerce feeds, right? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a good question though, because actually, in reading, again, it's not something I had to do, but I didn't see like out-of-the-box support for commerce entities. So that could be one of those things. It might be a completely separate contributed project. I think out of the box, it's not going to do that for you. Yeah, and I totally forgot to give the book away to somebody.
Pick a number?
Yeah, let's pick a number. Picking number between 1 and 10. Yes.
10.
6.
3, 7, 5.
Well, let's do one more question and then we'll do pick a number for the book. Yes.
I've never used the Migrate module personally. When you're moving both users and nodes,
Yeah.
do you have to do separate migrations for each of those, or is there just one huge migration they use to port everything over?
I would do it as 2 separate ones. If you were brave, you could try to do it in one. It's probably better to do it in 2. You have more control. If something gets messed up, you'll be able to find it easier. Even like doing like users and then like user profiles, like those are 2 different things. Hard to beat a Drupal. So most likely you're going to have doing those as 2 separate migrations. First the user data, then their profile data later.
So basically the larger the amount of data that you're migrating, you're probably going to break it out more into like chunks.
Yeah. I would. I think the last time I did this, I ended up with way more migration classes than I thought, because I was like, well, let's just put it in a new migration. But again, it just depends on your source data. If you can, structure your query in a way that you can get all the data comfortably in your SQL query and map it to fields, then go for it. It'll save you time. So I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10. Closest.
7.
1, 2,
9, 3,
4.
I haven't really heard the number yet.
6, 10,
9.
Every other number but
8, 2,
Who's at 8? All right, 8. Drush book. Here you go. Well, do you just want to pick it up after we're done? We're done.
Throw it.
Thanks, guys.